everybody, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas, Life Alchemist, and I'm here for another edition of Weekend Book Club. So we are picking back up with The Body Keeps the Score. This is a book by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD, and it talks about just how we hold energy in the body. Yeah, in the body, and it manifests as disease, as mental disorders, and a bunch of other things. And so this says brain, mind, and body in the healing of trauma, and it makes the connections between different traumatic situations and how it corresponds with our mental and physical health. So if you have not watched the first few weeks of this series, please go back and watch those, because that is the beginning, like the building blocks of this series, and we are now on week 7. So just to give you a little reference as to where we are. I do have a link down below in the description box for the book if you would like to buy your own. It's not necessary because I am reading it to you. And also my link tree is down there, so that has all of my information. My email down below if you would like to get in touch with me. Also, I'm doing private tarot and oracle reading, so if you would like to book one of those, it's down in my link tree as well, along with my donation links and my Teespring shop, which is now open, and it has just some Life Alchemist swag. So awesome. Let's go ahead and get started. So again, we are picking up from last week, and this is going to be on page 115. This is a section called Living with the Parents You Have. Children have a biological instinct to attach. They have no choice. Whether their parents are caregivers are loving and caring or distant, insensitive, rejecting, or abusive, children will develop a coping style based on their attempt to get at least some of their needs met. We now have reliable ways to assess and identify these coping styles, thanks largely to the work of 2 American scientists, Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, and their colleagues, who conducted thousands of hours of observation of mother-infant pairs over so many years. Based on these studies, Ainsworth created a research tool called the Strange Situation, which looks at how an infant reacts to temporary separation from the mother. Just as Bowlby had observed, securely attached infants are distressed when their mother leaves them, but they show delight when she returns. After a brief check-in for reassurance, they settle down and resume their play. But with infants who are insecurely attached, the picture is more complex. Children whose primary caregiver is unresponsive or rejecting learn to deal with their anxiety in 2 distinct ways. The researchers noticed that some seemed chronically upset and demanding with their mothers, while others were more passive and withdrawn. In both groups, contact with the mothers failed to settle them down, but they did not return to play contently, as happens in secure attachment. In one pattern called avoidant attachment, the infants look like nothing really bothers them. They don't cry when their mother goes away, and they ignore her when she comes back. However, this does not mean they are unaffected. In fact, their chronically increased heart rates show that they are in a constant state of hyperarousal. Excuse me for clearing my throat so much. I'm still getting over congestion from being sick a few weeks ago, so I apologize. That's why my voice is like this as well. My colleagues and I call this pattern dealing but not feeling, quote unquote. Most mothers of avoidant infants seem to dislike touching their children. They have trouble snuggling and holding them, and they don't use their facial expressions and voices to create pleasurable back and forth rhythms with their babies. In another pattern called quote-unquote anxious or quote-unquote ambivalent attachment, the infants constantly draw attention to themselves by crying, yelling, clinging, or screaming. They are quote-unquote feeling but not dealing. They seem to have concluded that unless they make a spectacle, nobody is going to pay attention to them. They become enormously upset when they do not know where their mother is, but derive little comfort from her return. And even though they do not seem to enjoy her company, they stay passively or angrily focused on her, even in situations when other children would rather play. Attachment researchers think that the 3 organized attachment strategies, which are secure, avoidant, and anxious, work because they elicit the best care a particular caregiver is capable of providing. Infants who encounter a consistent pattern of care, even if it's marked by emotional distance or insensitivity, can adapt to maintain the relationship. That does not mean that there are no problems. Attachment patterns often persist into adulthood. Anxious toddlers tend to grow into anxious adults, while avoidant toddlers are likely to become adults who are out of touch with their own feelings and those of others. As in, there's nothing wrong with a good spanking. I got hit and it made me the success I am today. In school, avoidant children are likely to bully other kids, while the anxious children are often their victims. However, development is not linear, and many life experiences can intervene to change these outcomes. But there's another group that is less stably adapted, a group that makes up the bulk of the children who we treat, and a substantial portion of the adults who are seen in psychiatric clinics. Some 20 years ago, Mary Main and her colleagues at Berkeley began to identify a group of children, about 15% of those they studied, who seemed to be unable to figure out how to engage with their caregivers. The critical issue turned out to be that the caregivers themselves were a source of distress or terror to the children. Excuse me. Children in this situation have no one to turn to, and they are faced with an unsolvable dilemma. Their mothers are simultaneously necessary for survival and a source of fear. They can neither approach the secure and ambivalent strategies, shift their attention, the avoidant strategy, nor flee. If you observe such children in a nursery school or attachment laboratory, you see them look toward their parents when they enter the room and then quickly turn away, unable to choose between seeking closeness and avoiding the parent. They may rock on their hands and knees, appear to go into a trance, freeze with their arms raised up, or get up to greet their parent and then fall to the ground. Not knowing who is safe or whom they belong to, they may be intensely affectionate with strangers or may trust nobody. Main called this pattern disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment is fright without solution. And we are now in a new section. This section is called Becoming Disorganized Within. Conscientious parents often become alarmed when they discover attachment research, worrying that their occasional impatience or their ordinary lapses in attunement may permanently damage their kids. In real life, there are bound to be misunderstandings, inept responses, and failures of communication. Both mothers and fathers miss cues or are simply preoccupied with other matters. Infants are frequently left to their own devices to discover how they can calm themselves down. Within limits, this is not a problem. Kids need to learn to handle frustrations and disappointments. With good enough caregivers, children learn that broken connections can be repaired. The critical issue is whether they can incorporate a feeling of being viscerally safe with their parents or other caregivers. Excuse me. In a study of attachment patterns in over 2,000 infants in normal, quote unquote, middle class environments, 62% were found to be secure, 15% avoidant, 9% anxious, 9% anxious, also known as ambivalent, and 15% disorganized. Interestingly, this large study showed the child's gender and basic temperament have little effect on attachment style. For example, children with difficult temperaments are not more likely to develop a disorganized style. Kids with from lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to be disorganized, with parents often severely stressed by economic and family instability. Kids who don't feel safe in infancy have trouble regulating their moods and emotional responses as they grow older. By kindergarten, many disorganized infants are either aggressive or spaced out and disengaged, and they go on to develop a range of psychiatric problems. They also show more physiological stress as expressed in heart rate variability, stress hormone responses, and lowered immune factors. Does this kind of biological dysregulation automatically reset to normal as a child matures or is moved to a safe environment? So far as we know, it does not. Parental abuse is not the only cause of disorganized attachment. Parents who are preoccupied with their own traumas, such as domestic abuse or rape, or the recent death of a parent or sibling may also be too emotionally unstable and inconsistent to offer much comfort and protection. While all parents need all the help they can get to help raise secure children, traumatized parents in particular need help to be attuned to their children's needs. Caregivers often don't realize that they are out of tune. I vividly remember a videotape Beatrice Beebe showed me. It featured a young mother playing with her 3-month-old infant. Everything was going well until the baby pulled back and turned his head away, signaling that he needed a break. But the mother did not pick up on this cue, and she intensified her efforts to engage him by bringing her face closer to his and increasing the volume of her voice. When he recoiled even more, she kept bouncing and poking him. Finally, he started to scream, at which point the mother put him down and walked away, looking crestfallen. She obviously felt terrible, but she had simply missed the relevant cues. It's easy to imagine how this kind of misattunement, repeated over and over again, can gradually lead to a chronic disconnection. Anyone who's raised a colicky or hyperactive baby knows how quickly stress rises when nothing seems to make a difference. Chronically failing to calm her baby down and establish an enjoyable face-to-face interaction, the mother is likely to come to perceive him as a difficult child who makes her feel like a failure and give up on trying to comfort her child. In practice, it often is difficult to distinguish the problems that result from disorganized attachment from those that result from trauma. They are often intertwined. My colleague, Rachel Yehuda, studied rates of PTSD in adult New Yorkers who had been assaulted or raped. Those whose mothers were Holocaust survivors with PTSD had a significantly higher rate of developing serious psychological problems after these traumatic experiences. The most reasonable explanation is that their upbringing had left them with a vulnerable physiology, making it difficult for them to regain their equilibrium after being violated. Yehuda found a similar vulnerability in the children of pregnant women who were in the World Trade Center that fatal day in 2001. Similarly, the reactions of children to painful events are largely determined by how calm or stressed their parents are. My former student, Glenn Sakes, now chairman of the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NYU, showed that when children were hospitalized for treatment of severe burns, the development of PTSD could be predicted by how safe they felt with their mothers. The security of their attachment to their mothers predicted the amount of morphine that was required to control their pain. Interesting. The more secure the attachment, the less painkiller was needed. Another colleague, Claude Chetob, who directs the Family Trauma Research Program at NYU Langone Medical Center, studied 112 New York City children who had directly witnessed the terrorist attacks on 9/11. Children whose mothers were diagnosed with PTSD or depression during follow-up were 6 times more likely to have significant emotional problems and 11 times more likely to be hyper-aggressive in response to their experience. Children whose fathers had PTSD showed behavioral problems as well, but Chimtub discovered that this effect was indirect and was transmitted via the mother. Living with an irascible, withdrawn, or terrified spouse is likely to impose a major psychological burden on the partner, including depression. If you have no internal sense of security, it is difficult to distinguish between safety and danger. If you feel chronically numbed out, potentially dangerous situations may help you feel alive. If you conclude that you must be a terrible person, because why else would your parents have treated you that way, you start expecting other people to treat you horribly. You probably deserve it, and anyway, there is nothing you can do about it. But disorganized people carry self-perceptions like these. They are set up to be traumatized by subsequent experiences. Interesting. As I'm reading this stuff, I start to not categorize myself, but I start to understand some certain patterns that I've had in my life. And I'll be vulnerable and say that I think I might have suffered from being a disorganized child to some degree. Interesting. This is a new section called the long-term effects of disorganized attachment. In the 1980s, my colleague Carlin Lenz Ruth, a Harvard attachment researcher, began to videotape face-to-face interactions between mothers and their infants at 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. She taped them again, and when the children were 5 years old, and once more when they were 7 or 8. All were from high-risk families. 100% met federal poverty guidelines, and almost half of the mothers were single parents. Disorganized attachment showed up in two different ways. One group of mothers seemed to be too preoccupied with their own issues to attend to their infants. They were often intrusive and hostile. They altered between rejecting their infants and acting as if they expected them to respond to their needs. Another group of mothers seemed helpless and fearful. They often came across as sweet or fragile, but they didn't know how to be the adult in the relationship and seemed to want their children to comfort them. They failed to grieve their children after having been away and did not pick them up when the children were distressed. The mothers didn't seem to be doing these things deliberately. They simply didn't know how to be attuned to their kids and respond to their cues, and thus failed to comfort and reassure them. The hostile, intrusive mothers were more likely to have childhood histories of physical abuse and or witnessing domestic violence, while the withdrawn, dependent mothers were more likely to have histories of sexual abuse or parental loss, but not physical abuse. I have always wondered how parents come to abuse their kids. After all, raising healthy offspring is at the very core of our human sense of purpose and meaning. What could drive parents to deliberately hurt or neglect their children? Carlin's research provided me with one answer. Watching her videos, I could see the children becoming more and more inconsolable, sullen, or resistant to their misattuned mothers. At the same time, the mothers became increasingly frustrated, defeated, and helpless in their interactions. Once the mother comes to see the child, not as her partner in an attuned relationship, but as a frustrating and raging disconnected stranger, the stage is set for subsequent abuse. About 18 years later, when the kids were around 20 years old, Lyons Ruth did a follow-up study to see how they were coping. Infants with seriously disrupted emotional communication patterns with their mothers at 18 months grew up to become young adults with an unstable sense of self. Self-damaging impulsivity, including excessive spending, promiscuous sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, and binge eating, inappropriate and intense anger, and recurrent suicidal behavior. Carlin and her colleagues had expected that hostile, intrusive behavior on the part of the mothers would be the most powerful predictor of mental instability in their adult children, but they discovered otherwise. Emotional withdrawal had the most profound and long-lasting impact. Emotional distance and role reversal, in which mothers expected the kids to look after them, were specifically linked to aggressive behavior against self and others in the young adults. And now we're moving on to the next section called dissociation, knowing and not knowing. This is on page 121. Lyons Ruth was particularly interested in the phenomenon of dissociation, which manifested in feeling lost, overwhelmed, abandoned, and disconnected from the world, and in seeing oneself as unloved, empty, helpless, trapped, and weighed down. She found a striking and unexpected relationship between maternal disengagement and misattunement during the first 2 years of life and dissociative symptoms in early childhood. Lyons Ruth includes that infants who are not truly seen and known by their mothers are at high risk to grow into adults who are unable to know and to see. Infants who live in secure relationships learn to communicate not only their frustrations and distress, but also their emerging selves, their interests, preferences, and goals. Receiving a sympathetic response cushions infants and adults against extreme levels of frightened arousal. But if your caregivers ignore your needs or resent your very existence, you learn to anticipate rejection and withdrawal. You cope as well as you can by blocking out your mother's hostility or neglect and act as if it doesn't matter, but your body is likely to remain in a state of high alert, prepared to ward off blows, deprivation, or abandonment. Dissociation means simultaneously knowing and not knowing. Bowlby wrote, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self," and that's a quote. If you cannot tolerate what you know or feel what you feel, the only option is denial and dissociation. Maybe the most devastating long-term effect of this shutdown is not feeling real inside, a condition we saw in the kids in the children's clinic, and that we see in the children and adults who come to the trauma center. When you don't feel real, nothing matters, which makes it impossible to protect yourself from danger. Or you may resort to extremes in an effort to feel something, even cutting yourself with a blade or getting into fistfights with strangers. Carlin's research showed that dissociation is learned early. Later abuse, excuse me, or other traumas did not account for dissociative symptoms in young adults. Abuse and trauma accounted for many other problems, but not for chronic dissociation or aggression against self. The critical underlying issue was that these parents did not know how to feel safe. Lack of safety within the early caregiving relationship led to an impaired sense of inner reality, excessive clinging, and self-damaging behavior. Poverty, single parenthood, or maternal psychiatric symptoms did not predict these symptoms. This does not imply that child abuse is irrelevant, but that the quality of early caregiving is critically important in preventing mental health problems, independent of other traumas. For that reason, treatment needs to address not only the imprints of specific traumatic events, but also the consequences of not having been mirrored, attuned to, and giving consistent care and affection, dissociation, and loss of self-regulation. Really interesting that they talk about, excuse me, talking about the early childhood years and the quality of care giving or parental guidance and nurturing and love and attention. And how that directly affects our development and our mental and physical status in life, because this ties straight into Eastern Body, Western Mind, which is another book that I'm going to be going through. This is all about chakras and destabilization, overexpression or underexpression in our chakras, and how that directly correlates with physical manifestations of disease or mental anguish or mental situations as well. So very beautiful how this ties in. And that I'm actually going to be starting that show on Monday, August 1st. So yeah, we're about to move on to the next section. This is called Restoring Synchrony. Early attachment patterns create the inner maps that chart our relationships throughout life, not only in terms of what we expect from others, but also in terms of how much comfort and pleasure we can experience in their presence. I doubt that the poet E.E. Cummings could have written his joyous lines, quote, "I like my body when it is with your body, muscles better and nerves more," unquote, if his earliest experiences had been frozen faces and hostile glances. Our relationship maps are implicit, etched into the emotional brain, and not reversibly simple by understanding how they were created. You may realize that your fear of intimacy has nothing to do with your mother's postpartum depression or with the fact that she herself was molested as a child, but that alone is unlikely to open you to happy. Happy, trusting engagement with others. However, that realization may help you to start exploring other ways to connect in relationships, both for your own sake and in order to not pass on an insecure attachment to your own children. In part 5, I'll discuss a number of approaches to healing damaged attunement systems through training and rhythmicity and reciprocity. Being in sync with oneself and with others requires the integration of our body-based senses, vision, hearing, touch, and balance. If this did not happen in infancy and early childhood, there is an increased chance of later sensory integration problems, to which trauma and neglect are by no means the only pathways. Being in sync means resonating through sounds and movements that connect, which are embedded in the daily sensory rhythms of cooking and cleaning, going to bed, and waking. Being in sync may mean sharing funny faces and hugs, expressing delight or approval at the right moments, tossing balls back and forth, or singing together. At the Trauma Center, we have developed programs to coach parents in connection with attunement, and my patients have told me about many other ways to get themselves in sync, ranging from choral singing and ballroom dancing to joining basketball teams, jazz bands, and chamber music groups. All of these foster a sense of attunement and communal pleasure. So we are moving to chapter 8 now, and this is called Trapped in Relationships, the Cost of Abuse and Neglect. This is on page 123. Excuse me. It starts with a quote by Stephen Cope. The night sea journey is the journey into the parts of ourselves that are split off, disavowed, unknown, unwanted, cast out, and exiled to the various subterranean worlds of consciousness. The goal of this journey is to reunite us with ourselves. Such a homecoming can be surprisingly painful, but even brutal. In order to undertake it, we must first agree to exile nothing. That's beautiful. I feel like that's like, honestly, such a big portion of what my channel is all about, is just helping people to explore those parts of themselves that were left behind, that they feel like they can't love, they can't forgive, the things that are suppressed or are feared within ourselves, and just old stagnant energy, to bring it up for healing. Beautiful. The night sea journey. Okay. Okay. Marilyn was a tall, athletic-looking woman in her mid-30s who worked as an operating room nurse in a nearby town. She told me that a few months earlier, she'd started to play tennis at her sports club with a Boston fireman named Michael. She usually steered clear of men, she said, but she had gradually become comfortable enough with Michael to accept his invitation to go out for pizza after their matches. They'd talk about tennis, movies, their nephews and nieces, nothing too personal. Michael clearly enjoyed her company, but she told herself he didn't really know her. On Saturday evening in August, after tennis and pizza, she invited him to stay over at their apartment. She described feeling uptight and unreal as soon as they were alone together. She remembered asking him to go slow, but had very little sense of what had happened after that. After a few glasses of wine and a rerun of Law and Order, they apparently fell asleep together on top of her bed. At around 2 a.m, Michael turned over in his sleep. When Marilyn felt his body touch hers, she exploded, pounding him with her fists, scratching and biting, screaming, "You bastard! You bastard!" Michael startled awake and grabbed his belongings and fled. After he left, Marilyn sat on her bed for hours, stunned by what had happened. She felt deeply humiliated and hated herself for what she had done, and now she'd come to me for help in dealing with her terror of men and her inexplicable rage attacks. My work with veterans had prepared me to listen to painful stories like Marilyn's without trying to jump in immediately to fix the problem. Therapy often starts with some inexplicable behavior, attacking a boyfriend in the middle of the night, feeling terrified when somebody looks you in the eye, finding yourself covered with blood after cutting yourself with a piece of glass, or deliberately vomiting up every meal. It takes time and patience to allow the reality behind such symptoms to reveal itself. The next section, terror and numbness. As we talked, Marilyn told me that Michael was the first man she'd taken home in more than 5 years, but this was not the first time she'd lost control when a man spent the night with her. She repeated that she always felt uptight and spaced out when she was alone with a man, and there had been other times when she'd come to in her apartment, cowering in a corner, unable to remember clearly what had happened. Marilyn also said she felt as if she was just going through the motions of having a life, except for when she was at the club playing tennis or working in the operating room. She usually felt numb. A few years earlier, she found that she could relieve her numbness by scratching herself with a razor blade, but she'd become frightened when she found that she was cutting herself more and more deeply and more often to get relief. She had tried alcohol too, but that reminded her of her dad and his out-of-control drinking, which made her feel disgusted with herself. So instead, she played tennis fanatically whenever she could. That made her feel alive. When I asked her about her past, Marilyn said she guessed that she must have had a happy childhood, but she could remember very little from before age 12. She told me she had been a timid adolescent until she had a violent confrontation with her alcoholic father when she was 16 and ran away from home. She worked her way through community college and went on to get a degree in nursing without any help from her parents. She felt ashamed that during this time she slept around, which she described as looking for love in all the wrong places. As often As I often did with new patients, I asked her to draw a family portrait, and when I saw her drawing, which is, I'll show you all after this, I decided to go slowly. Clearly, Marilyn was harboring some terrible memories, but she could not allow herself to recognize what her own picture revealed. Holy crap. Sorry, I just looked at the picture fully. She had drawn a wild and terrified child trapped in some kind of cage and threatened not only by three nightmarish figures with no eyes, but also a huge erect penis protruding into her space. And yet this woman said she must have had a happy childhood. As the poet W.H. Auden wrote, truth, like love and sleep, resents approaches that are too intense. Okay, so here's this picture. You all just be if there's kids watching, you know, might maybe have them look away. So this is the picture they're talking about. And I'm guessing that right there is Marilyn, and these are her family members. I'm not sure who that is back there, but could be like a dissociated version of herself. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Moving on, I call this Auden's rule and in keeping with it, I deliberately did not push Marilyn to tell me what she remembered. In fact, I've learned that it's not important for me to know every detail of a patient's trauma. What is critical is that the patients themselves learn to tolerate feeling what they feel and knowing what they know. This may take weeks or even years. I decided to start Marilyn's treatment by inviting her to join an established therapy group where she could find support and acceptance before facing the engine of her distrust, shame, and rage. As I expected, Marilyn arrived at the first group meeting looking terrified, much like the girl in her family portrait. She was withdrawn and did not reach out to anybody. I'd chosen this group for her because its members had always been helpful and accepting of new members who were too scared to talk. They knew from their own experience that unlocking secrets is a gradual process. But this time they surprised me, asking so many intrusive questions about Marilyn's love life that I recalled her drawing of the little girl under assault. It was almost as though Marilyn had unwittingly enlisted the group to repeat her traumatic past. I intervened to help her set boundaries about what she talked about, and she began to settle in. 3 months later, Marilyn told the group that she had stumbled and fallen a few times on the sidewalk between the subway and my office. She worried that her eyesight was beginning to fail. She'd also been missing a lot of tennis balls recently. I thought again about her drawing in the wild. Hold on. Hey y'all, sorry. So I had another video exporting on my computer. When it finishes, it starts to play. So that's what that sound was. So let me pick back up where I was. She'd also been missing a lot of tennis balls recently. I thought again about her drawing in the wild child with the huge, terrified eyes. Was this some sort of conversion reaction in which patients express their conflicts by losing function in some part of their body? Many soldiers in both world wars had suffered paralysis that couldn't be traced to physical injuries. And I had seen these cases of hysterical blindness in Mexico and India. Still, as a physician, I wasn't about to conclude without further assessment that this was all in her head. I referred to her colleagues at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary and asked them to do a very thorough workup. Several weeks later, the test came back. Marilyn had lupus erythematosus in her retina, an autoimmune disease that was eroding her vision, and she would need immediate treatment. I was appalled. Marilyn was the third person that year whom I suspected of having an incest history and who was then diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, a disease in which the body starts attacking itself. After making sure that Marilyn was getting the proper medical care, I consulted with two of my colleagues at Massachusetts General, psychiatrist Scott Wilson and Richard Craden, who ran the immunology laboratory there. I told them Marilyn's story, showed them the picture she'd drawn, and asked them to collaborate on a study. They generously volunteered their time and the considerable expense of a full immunology workup. We recruited 12 women with incest histories who were not taking any medications, plus 12 women who had never been traumatized and who also did not take meds. A surprisingly difficult control group to find. Marilyn was not in the study. We generally do not ask our clinical patients to be part of the research efforts. When the study was completed and the data analyzed, Rich reported that the group of incest survivors had abnormalities in their CD45RA to RO ratio compared to their non-traumatized peers. CD45 cells are the memory cells of the immune system. Some of them, called RA cells, have been activated by past exposure to toxins. They quickly respond to environmental threats they have encountered before. The RO cells, in contrast, are kept in reserve for new challenges. They are turned on to deal with the threats the body has not met previously. The RA to RO ratio is the balance between cells that recognize known toxins and cells that wait for new information to activate. In patients with histories of incest, the proportion of RA cells that are ready to pounce is larger than normal. This makes the immune system oversensitive to threat, so that it is prone to mount a defense when none is needed, even when this means attacking the body's own cells. Our studies showed that on a deep level, the bodies of incest victims have trouble distinguishing between danger and safety. This means that the imprint of past trauma does not consist only of distorted perceptions of information coming from the outside. The organism itself also has a problem knowing how to feel safe. The past is impressed not only on their minds and in misinterpretations of innocuous events, as when Marilyn attacked Michael because he accidentally touched her in her sleep, but also on the very core of their beings, in the safety of their bodies. So we're going on to the next section called A Torn Map of the World. How do people learn what is safe and what is not safe? What is inside and what is outside? What should be resisted and what can be safely taken in? The best way we can understand the impact of our child abuse and neglect is to listen to what people like Marilyn can teach us. One of the things that became clear as I came to know her better was that she had her own unique view of how the world functions. As children, we start off at the center of our own universe, where we interpret everything that happens from an egocentric vantage point. If our parents or guardians keep telling us we're the cutest, most delicious thing in the world, we don't question their judgment. We must be exactly that. And deep down, no matter what else we learn about ourselves, we will carry that sense with us, that we are basically adorable. As a result, if we later hook up with somebody who treats us badly, we will be outraged. It won't feel right. It's not familiar. It's not like home. But if we are abused or ignored in childhood, or grow up in a family where sexuality is treated with disgust, and our inner map contains a different message. Our sense of self is marked by contempt and humiliation, and we are more likely to think he or she has my number and fail to protest if we are mistreated. Marilyn's past shaped her view of every relationship. She was convinced that men didn't give a damn about her feelings and that they got away with whatever they wanted. Women couldn't be trusted either. They were too weak to stand up for themselves, and they'd sell their bodies to get men to take care of them. If you were in trouble, they wouldn't lift a finger to help you. This worldview manifested itself in the way Marilyn approached her colleagues at work. She was suspicious of the motives of everyone who was kind to her and called them on the slightest deviation from the nursing regulations. As for herself, she was a bad seed, a fundamentally toxic person who made bad things happen to those around her. When I first encountered patients like Marilyn, I used to challenge their thinking and try to help them see the world in a more positive, flexible way. One day, a woman named Kathy set me straight. A group member had arrived late to a session because her car had broken down, and Kathy immediately blamed herself. I saw how rickety your car was last week. I knew I should have offered you a ride. Her self-criticism escalated to the point that only a few minutes later, she was taking responsibility for her sexual abuse. I brought it on myself. I was 7 years old and I loved my daddy. I wanted him to love me, and I did what he wanted me to do. It was my own fault. When I intervened to reassure her, saying, "Come on, you were just a little girl. It was your father's responsibility to maintain the boundaries." Kathy turned toward me. "You know, Bessel," she said, I know how important it is for you to be a good therapist, so when you make stupid comments like that, I usually thank you profusely. After all, I'm an incest survivor. I was trained to take care of the needs of grown up insecure men. But after 2 years, I trust you enough to tell you those those comments make me feel terrible. Yes, it's true. I instinctively blame myself for everything bad that happens to the people around me. I know it isn't rational, and I feel really dumb for feeling this way, but I do. When you try to talk me into being more reasonable, I only feel even more lonely and isolated. And it confirms the feeling that nobody in the whole world will ever understand what it feels like to be me. I genuinely thanked her for her feedback, and I've tried ever since not to tell my patients that they should not feel the way they do. Kathy taught me that my responsibility goes much deeper. I have to help them reconstruct their inner map of the world. As I discussed in the previous chapter, attachment researchers have shown that our earliest caregivers don't only feed us, dress us, and comfort us when we are upset, they shape the way our rapidly growing brain perceives reality. Our interactions with our caregivers convey what is safe and what is dangerous, whom we can count on and who will let us down, what we need to do to get our needs met. This information is embodied in the warp and woof of our brain circuitry and forms the template of how we think of ourselves and the world around us. These inner maps are remarkably stable across time. This doesn't mean, however, that our maps can't be modified by experience. A deep love relationship, particularly during adolescence, when the brain once again goes through a period of exponential change, truly can transform us. So can the birth of a child, as our babies often teach us how to love. Adults who were abused and neglected as children can still learn the beauty of intimacy and mutual trust, or have a deep spiritual experience that opens them to a larger universe. In contrast, previously uncontaminated childhood maps can become so distorted by an adult rape or assault that all roads are rerouted into terror or despair. These responses are not responsible and therefore cannot be, or I'm sorry, these responses are not reasonable and therefore cannot be changed simply by reframing irrational beliefs. Our maps of the world are encoded in the emotional brain, and changing them means having to reorganize a part of the central nervous system, the subject of the treatment section of this book. Nonetheless, learning to recognize irrational thoughts and behavior can be a useful first step. People like Marilyn often discover that their assumptions are not the same as those of their friends. If they are lucky, their friends and colleagues will tell them in words rather than in actions that their distrust and self-hatred make collaboration difficult. But that rarely happens, and Marilyn's experience was typical. After she assaulted Michael, he had absolutely no interest in working things out, and she lost both his friendship and her favorite tennis partner. It is at this point that smart and courageous people like Marilyn, who maintain their curiosity and determination in the face of repeated defeats, start looking for help. Generally, the rational brain can override the emotional brain as long as our fears don't hijack us. For example, your fear of being flagged down by the police can turn instantly to gratitude when the cop warns you that there's an accident ahead. But the moment we feel trapped, enraged, or rejected, we are vulnerable to activating old maps and to follow their directions. Change begins when we learn to own our emotional brains. That means learning to observe and tolerate the heartbreaking and gut-wrenching sensations that register misery and humiliation. Only after learning to bear what's going on inside can we start to befriend rather than obliterate the emotions that keep our maps fixed and immutable. So we have one more section and we are done for this week. So you all, if you are resonating with this, actually, you know what? I might just go ahead and finish this chapter because there's only one more page turn. Okay. If you're resonating with this, please remember to like the video and comment if you have any thoughts or anything on this. Yeah, so let's go ahead and finish this out. About a year into this is called Learning to Remember, page 130. About a year into Marilyn's group, another member, Mary, asked permission to talk about what had happened to her when she was 13 years old. Mary worked as a prison guard, and she was involved in a sadomasochistic relationship with another woman. She wanted the group to know her background in the hope that they would become more tolerant of her extreme reactions, such as her tendency to shut down or blow up in response to the slightest provocation. Struggling to get the words out, Mary told us that one evening when she was 13 years old, she was raped by her older brother and a gang of his friends. The rape resulted in pregnancy, and her mother gave her an abortion at home on the kitchen table. Wow. The group sensitively tuned into what Mary was sharing and comforted her through her sobbing. I was profoundly moved by their empathy. They were consoling Mary in a way that they must have wished somebody had comforted them when they first confronted their traumas. When time ran out, Marilyn asked if she could take a few more minutes to talk about what she had experienced during the session. The group agreed, and she told us, hearing that story, I wonder if I may have been sexually abused myself. My mouth must have dropped open. Based on her family drawing, I had always assumed that she was aware, at least on some level, that this was the case. She had reacted like an incest victim in her response to Michael, and she chronically behaved as if the world were a terrifying place. Yet, even though she had drawn a girl who was being sexually molested, she, or at least her cognitive verbal self, had no idea what had actually happened to her. Her immune system, her muscles, and her fear system had all kept the score, but her conscious mind lacked a story that would communicate the experience. She reenacted her trauma in life, but she had no narrative to refer to. As we will see in chapter 12, traumatic memory differs in complex ways from normal recall, and it involves many layers of the mind and brain. Triggered by Mary's story and spurred on by the nightmares that followed, Marilyn began individual therapy with me, in which she started to deal with her past. At first, she experienced waves of intense, free-floating terror. She tried stopping for several weeks, but when she found she could no longer sleep and she had to take time off of work, she continued our sessions. As she told me later, my only criterion for whether a situation is harmful is feeling, quote, this is going to kill me if I don't get out, end quote. I began to teach Marilyn calming techniques such as focusing on breathing deeply in and out at 6 breaths a minute, while following the sensations of the breath of her body. This was combined with tapping acupressure points, which helped her not to become overwhelmed. We also worked on mindfulness, learning to keep her mind alive while allowing her body to feel the feelings that she had come to dread slowly, enabled Marilyn to stand back and observe her experience, rather than being immediately hijacked by her feelings. She had tried to dampen or abolish those feelings with alcohol and exercise, but now she began to feel safe enough to begin to remember what had happened to her as a girl. As she gained ownership over her physical sensations, she also began to be able to tell the difference between past and present. Now, if she felt someone's leg brush against her in the night, she might be able to recognize it as Michael's leg, the leg of the handsome tennis partner she'd invited to her apartment. That leg did not belong to anyone else, and its touch didn't mean someone was trying to molest her. Being still enabled her to fully physically know, that she was a 34-year-old woman and not a little girl. When Marilyn finally began to access her memories, they emerged as flashbacks of the wallpaper in her childhood bedroom. She realized that this was what she focused on when her father raped her when she was 8 years old. Her molestation had scared her beyond her capacity to endure, so she had needed to push it out of her memory bank. After all, she had to keep living with this man, her father, who had assaulted her. Marilyn remembered having turned to her mother for protection, but when she ran to her and tried to hide herself by burying her face in her mother's skirt, she was met with only a limp embrace. At times, her mother remained silent. At others, she cried or angrily scolded Marilyn for, quote unquote, making daddy so angry. The terrified child found no one to protect her, to offer strength or shelter. As Roland Summit wrote in his classic study, The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, quote, initiation, intimidation, stigmatization, isolation, helplessness, and self-blame depend on a terrifying reality of child sexual abuse. Any attempts by the child to divulge the secret will be countered by an adult conspiracy of silence and disbelief. Don't worry about things like that. could never happen in our family. How could you ever think of such a terrible thing? Don't let me ever hear you say anything like that again. The average child never asks and never tells." End quote. After 40 years of doing this work, I still regularly hear myself saying, "That's unbelievable." When patients tell me about their childhoods, oh, that's unbelievable. When patients tell me about their childhoods, they often are as incredulous as I am. How could parents inflict such torture and terror on their own child? Part of them continues to insist that they must have made the experience up or that they are exaggerating. All of them are ashamed about what happened to them and they blame themselves on some level. They firmly believe that these terrible things were done to them because they were terrible people. Marilyn now began to explore how the powerless child had learned to shut down and comply with whatever was asked of her. She had done so by making herself disappear. The moment she heard her father's footsteps in the corridor outside her bedroom, she would put her head in the clouds. Another patient of mine had a similar experience and made a drawing that depicts how the process works. Another patient who had a similar experience made a drawing that depicts how the process works. When her father started to touch her, she made herself disappear. She floated up to the ceiling, looking down on some other little girl in the bed. She was glad it was not really her. It was some other girl who was being molested. Looking at these heads separated from their bodies by an impenetrable fog really opened my eyes to the experience of dissociation, which is so common among incest victims. Marilyn herself later realized that, as an adult, she had continued to float up to the ceiling when she found herself in a sexual situation. In the period where she'd been more sexually active, a partner would occasionally tell her how amazing she'd been in bed, that he'd barely recognized her, that she'd even talked differently. Usually she did not remember what had happened, but at other times she'd become angry and aggressive. She had no sense of who she was sexually, so she gradually withdrew from dating altogether until Michael. So here's a picture of that depiction of the woman who would dissociate as a child right here. Wow, this is interesting. That's her up there dissociating and looking down, like going outside her body, and that's her father's energy. Okay, so this is the last section. No, it's not. Okay, but this is the last page turn in this, and then we're gonna go, then we'll be done for this week. Okay, so this is called Hating Your Home, page 133. Children have no choice who their parents are, nor can they understand that parents may simply be too depressed, enraged, or spaced out to be there for them, or that their parents' behavior may have little to do with them. Children have no choice but to recognize themselves to survive within their families, but to organize themselves to survive within the families they have. Unlike adults, they have no other authorities to turn to for help. Their parents are the authorities. They cannot rent an apartment or move in with someone else. Their very survival hinges on their caregivers. Children sense, even if they are not explicitly threatened, that if they talked about their beatings or molestation to teachers, they would be punished. Instead, they focus their energy on not thinking about what has happened and not feeling the residues of terror and panic in their bodies. Because they cannot tolerate knowing what they have experienced, they also cannot understand that their anger, terror, or collapse has anything to do with that experience. They don't talk. They act and deal with their feelings by being enraged, shut down, compliant, or defiant. Children are also programmed to be fundamentally loyal to their caregivers, even if they are abused by them. Terror increases the need for attachment, even if the source of comfort is also the source of terror. I have never met a child below the age of 10 who was tortured at home and who had broken bones and burned skin to show for it, who, if given the option, would not have chosen to stay with his or her family rather than being placed in a foster home. Of course, clinging to one's abuser is not exclusive to childhood. Hostages have put up bail for their captors, expressed a wish to marry them, or had sexual relations with them. Victims of domestic violence often cover up for their abusers. Judges often tell me how humiliated they feel when they try to protect victims of domestic violence by issuing restraining orders, only to find out that many of them secretly allow their partners to return. It took Marilyn a long time before she was ready to talk to her about her abuse. She was not ready to violate her loyalty to her family. Deep inside, she felt that she still needed them to protect her against her fears. The price of this Loyalty is unbearable feelings of loneliness, despair, and the inevitable rage of helplessness. Rage that has nowhere to go is redirected against the self in the form of depression, self-hatred, and self-destructive actions. One of my patients told me, quote, "It's like hating your home, your kitchen and pots and pans, your bed, your chairs, your table, your rugs." Quote, "Nothing feels safe, at least of all your own body." Learning to trust is a major challenge. One of my other patients, a school teacher whose grandfather raped her repeatedly before she was 6, sent me the following email, quote, "I started mulling the danger of opening up with you in traffic on the way home after our therapy appointment. And then, as I merged onto Route 124, I realized that I had broken the rule of not getting attached to you and to my students," end quote. During our next meeting, she told me that she had been raped by her lab instructor in college. I asked her whether she sought help and made a complaint against him. Quote, "I couldn't make myself cross the road to the clinic," end quote. Or she replied, "Sorry, I was desperate for help, but as I stood there, I felt very deeply that I would only be hurt even more. And that might well have been true. Of course, I had to hide what had happened from my parents and from everyone else." After I told her that I was concerned about what was going on with her, she wrote me another email, quote, "I'm trying to remind myself that I didn't do anything to deserve such treatment. I don't think I have ever had anyone look at me like that and say they were worried about me. And I'm holding on to it like a treasure. The idea that I am worth being worried about by someone I respect and who does understand how deeply I am struggling now." End quote. In order to know who you are, to have an identity, we must know, or at least feel what we know, what is and what was, quote unquote, real. We must observe that what we see around us and label it correctly. We must also be able to trust our memories and be able to tell them apart from our imagination. Losing the ability to make these distinctions is one sign of what psychoanalyst William Niederland said or called, quote unquote, soul murder. Erasing awareness and cultivating denial are often essential to survival, but the price is that you lose track of who you are, of what you are feeling, and of what and whom you can trust. This is the last section for this chapter, and we will be done for today. This is called Replaying the Trauma. One memory of Marilyn's childhood trauma came to her in a dream in which she felt as if she was being choked and was unable to breathe. A white tea towel was wrapped around her hands, and she was lifted up with the towel around her neck, so that she could not touch the ground with her feet. She woke in a panic, thinking that she was surely going to die. Her dream reminded me of the nightmares war veterans had reported to me, seeing the precise, unadulterated images of faces and body parts they had encountered in battle. These dreams were so terrifying that they tried to not fall asleep at night. Only daytime napping, which was not associated with nocturnal ambushes, felt halfway safe. During this stage of therapy, Marilyn was repeatedly flooded with images and sensations related to the choking dream. She remembered sitting in the kitchen as a 4-year-old with swollen eyes, a sore neck, and a bloody nose while her father and brother laughed at her and called her a stupid, stupid girl. One day, Marilyn reported, quote, "As I was brushing my teeth last evening, I was overcome with feelings of thrashing around. I was like a fish out of water, violently turning my body as I fought against the lack of air. I sobbed and choked as I brushed my teeth. Panic was rising out of my chest with a feeling of thrashing. I had to use every bit of strength I had not to scream, 'No, no, 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 no,' as I stood over the sink," end quote. She went to bed and fell asleep, but woke up like clockwork every 2 hours during the rest of the night. Trauma is not stored as a narrative with an orderly beginning, middle, and end, as I'll discuss in detail in chapters 11 and 12. Memories initially return as they did for Marilyn as flashbacks, but contain fragments of the experience, isolated images, sounds, and body sensations that initially have no context other than fear and panic. When Marilyn was a child, she had no way of giving voice to the unspeakable, and it would have made no difference anyway. Nobody was listening. Like so many survivors of childhood abuse, Marilyn exemplified the power of the life force, the will to live and to own one's life, the energy that counteracts the annihilation of trauma. I gradually came to realize that the only thing that makes it possible to do the work of healing trauma is all at the dedication to survival that enabled my patients to endure their abuse and then to endure the dark nights of the soul that inevitably occur on the road to recovery. Wow. Okay, that is the end of week 7 reading, and that is the end also of chapter 8. Wow, wow, wow. Some heavy material here, you all. So let me know if you have any thoughts or anything on this. If you feel comfortable sharing any of your personal victory stories or any anything that any comments or insights or whatever, maybe things that you do to work through traumas, however comfortable you feel sharing yourself out there, you all. I just want people to know that clearly from this book, it shows that this trauma, feeling caged and locked in a home and not being able to go to your parents for help because they're the ones abusing you or they're neglecting the child, that is not an uncommon thing. Clearly, we're seeing right here that that's happened to more people than we know, men and women, and it's so suppressed and it's hidden down in the memory bank. So if there's anything you can share in the comments that might be encouraging to others who maybe are trying to find the will to speak up or on their own journey of discovery and soul retrieval and just regaining their willpower, please share, you all. This is our community. This is our alchemist tribe here. We are here to facilitate healing, not just me. This is not my channel only. This is your channel as well. This is your platform, and we are here to help each other in this soul healing process. So please, if you have anything to share, please do that. I would highly appreciate it. So you all, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, share this video or share this series. I guess the playlist would be better since it's in order. But share this with anyone who you might think needs this information. Yeah, so you are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and so loved. Please remember that, you all. I love you, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.